Behind the golden gates of Buckingham Palace, where centuries of tradition meet modern reality, a crisis was brewing that would test the very foundations of the British monarchy. While the world watched through camera lenses and headlines, few could see the personal battles raging within the royal family itself. In the eye of this storm stood Princess, and known for her unwavering dedication and no-nonsense approach to royal duty. But when whispers of discord began to echo through the palace corridors, and when Prince William and Catherine found themselves facing unprecedented challenges and would be forced to make choices that could either strengthen the crown or shake it to its core. What happens when loyalty meets adversity? When family bonds are tested by public scrutiny and private pain? This is the story of how Princess and the hardest-working royal stepped forward during the monarchy's darkest hour to show that sometimes solidarity speaks louder than words. The palace walls have always kept secrets, but some stories demand to be told. The morning mist hung low over Windsor Castle as Princess adjusted her riding helmet and prepared for her daily horseback ride. It was barely dawn, and most of the royal household was still sleeping, but had never been one to waste daylight. Her routine had remained unchanged for decades. Up before sunrise, a vigorous ride through the castle grounds, then straight into a day packed with royal engagements. But this particular morning felt different, as her horse's hooves clicked against the cobblestones and couldn't shake the feeling that storm clouds were gathering over the royal family. The previous evening's phone call from her nephew William still echoed in her mind. His voice had carried a weight she hadn't heard since his mother's death, a mixture of exhaustion and barely controlled frustration that set off alarm bells in her experienced mind, and had always prided herself on staying above the fray of royal drama. While others in the family seemed to attract scandal like magnets, she had built her reputation on steady, reliable service. At 73, she had completed more royal engagements than any other member of the family for decades running. The press called her the hardest-working royal, and she wore that title like a badge of honor. The castle grounds were peaceful in the early morning light, but Anne's mind was anything but quiet. William's words from the night before kept replaying, "Aunt," and "I don't know how much more of this we can take." The press, the constant speculation about Catherine's health, the way they're treating our children. Something has to give. Catherine's absence from public engagements had sparked a media frenzy that seemed to grow more intense with each passing day. What had started as routine recovery time after her surgery had somehow transformed into a royal mystery that consumed tabloid headlines and social media discussions. The speculation ranged from the mundane to the wildly inappropriate, with conspiracy theories spreading faster than palace officials could address them, and had watched this unfold with growing concern. She had seen how the press could destroy lives, had witnessed firsthand what happened when the royal family became the subject of relentless public scrutiny. Her own daughter Zara had chosen a life largely outside the spotlight precisely because of what she had observed growing up in the royal fishbowl. As she guided her horse along the familiar paths, Anne's thoughts drifted to Catherine. She had always admired her niece-in-law's grace under pressure, the way she had adapted to royal life while maintaining her own identity. Catherine had brought a fresh perspective to the family, modernizing their approach while respecting traditions that stretched back centuries. The young woman had faced challenges that would have broken lesser spirits. The intense scrutiny that began the moment her relationship with William became public, the constant comparison to Diana, the pressure to produce heirs while maintaining a perfect public image. Catherine had navigated it all with remarkable poise. But even the strongest people had their breaking point. Anne's phone buzzed with an encrypted message from her private secretary. Another emergency meeting had been called at Buckingham Palace, the second one this week. These meetings had become increasingly frequent as the situation with Catherine's absence continued to dominate headlines. Palace officials were struggling to maintain the delicate balance between respecting the family's privacy and satisfying the public's insatiable appetite for information. The Princess Royal had attended the previous meeting, sitting quietly while advisors debated response strategies and damage control measures. She had listened to discussions about coordinated media campaigns, carefully crafted statements, and strategic appearances designed to redirect public attention. But as she sat through hours of such talk and couldn't help but feel that they were missing something fundamental. This wasn't just about public relations or media management. This was about family, about protecting people she cared about who were clearly struggling under pressure that few could truly understand. William and Catherine weren't just the future king and queen. They were a young couple trying to raise their children while carrying the weight of an ancient institution on their shoulders. The ride back to the castle took and past the memorial garden dedicated to her late mother. Queen Elizabeth II had faced her own share of crises during her remarkable reign. From the abdication crisis she inherited to the troubles of the 1990s that she called her annus horribilis. But even she had never dealt with the 24-hour news cycle and social media speculation that now seemed to define royal coverage. As and dismounted and handed the reins to a waiting groom, she made a decision that would prove pivotal in the weeks to come. She wouldn't wait for another palace meeting or official strategy session. She would do what she had always done when family was involved: take direct action. Her first stop was her private office, where she instructed her secretary to clear her afternoon schedule. Then, she placed a call to Clarence House, asking to speak with King Charles. The conversation was brief, but significant, and had always been one of the few people who could speak plainly to the monarch, a privilege earned through decades of unwavering loyalty and service. "Charles," she said without preamble, "we need to talk about William and Catherine. This situation is getting out of hand, and they need our support, not more meetings and strategy sessions." The king's response was immediate and concerned. He had been watching the situation unfold with growing anxiety, torn between his role as sovereign and his instincts as a father. The balance between public duty and family protection had never felt more delicate. Anne's next call was to William directly. She bypassed the usual protocol of going through his private secretary, using the family mobile number that only close relatives possessed. When William answered, she could hear the strain in his voice even more clearly than she had the night before. "I'm coming to see you and Catherine this afternoon," she announced. "Not for an official visit or a palace-sanctioned meeting. Just family. Is that acceptable?" The relief in William's voice was palpable. "More than acceptable. Anne, we really need that right now." The drive to Windsor took, and through the countryside she had known all her life. The rolling hills and ancient oak trees remained unchanged despite the turmoil that seemed to follow the royal family wherever they went. It was a reminder that beyond the palace walls and media attention, life continued at its own pace. As her car approached Adelaide Cottage and reflected on what she hoped to accomplish, she wasn't coming as the Princess Royal with an official agenda. She wasn't bringing palace advisors or media strategies. She was simply coming as an aunt who had watched her nephew struggle with impossible circumstances for far too long. The cottage, tucked away on the Windsor estate, had become William and Catherine's refuge. It was where they could try to live as normal a life as possible, away from the grand formality of their official residences, and had always approved of their choice to live here rather than in one of the larger royal properties. It showed they understood that happiness didn't depend on ceremony and grandeur. William met her at the door and was struck by how tired he looked. The man who would one day be king carried himself with the same dignity she remembered from his childhood, but there were new lines around his eyes, a tension in his shoulders that spoke of sleepless nights and constant worry. Catherine appeared a few moments later and felt a surge of protective anger at seeing how thin she had become. Whatever health challenges she had been facing, they had clearly taken a significant toll. But more than that, Anne could see the emotional exhaustion that came from being the subject of endless speculation and criticism. They sat in the cottage's modest living room, a space that felt worlds away from the grand staterooms where most royal business was conducted. Here, surrounded by family photos and children's artwork, the conversation could be honest in a way that was impossible in more formal settings. Tell me what's really happening, and said simply. Not the official version or what the advisors wanted to hear. What's really going on? What followed was a conversation that would change Anne's understanding of the pressures facing the modern royal family. William and Catherine spoke openly about the relentless nature of current media coverage, the way social media had amplified every whisper and rumor, the impact on their children who were beginning to notice the constant presence of photographers, and the tension in their parents' voices. Catherine, speaking quietly but with evident emotion, described the feeling of being trapped by circumstances beyond her control. Every decision we make gets analyzed and criticized, she said. If I appear in public too soon after surgery, I'm being careless with my health. If I take the time I need to recover, I'm hiding something or being difficult. There's no right answer anymore. William's frustration was more visible. As the heir to the throne, he felt the weight of protecting not just his wife and children, but the institution itself. The palace keeps telling us to trust the process, that this will all blow over, he said. But it's not blowing over. It's getting worse every day, and we're the ones paying the price. And listened without interruption, her experienced mind processing not just what they were saying, but what they weren't saying. She could see the cracks that constant pressure created, the way it strained even the strongest relationships. She had watched her own marriage suffer under similar pressures decades earlier. As the afternoon wore on, and began to understand that this crisis was about more than media management or public relations. It was about the fundamental question of how the royal family could function in an age of instant communication and social media speculation. The old rules of royal protocol and media relations had been written for a different era, and they were failing to protect the people who mattered most. When it came time for her to leave, and made another decision that would prove significant in the days to come. Instead of returning to her own residence, she instructed her driver to take her back to Buckingham Palace. There were conversations that needed to happen, and they needed to happen immediately. The evening light was fading as Anne's car pulled through the palace gates. She had spent the day seeing firsthand the human cost of the current crisis, and she was determined to ensure that the family's response would prioritize protecting William and Catherine rather than managing public perception. As she walked through the palace corridors toward the king's private apartments and reflected on the choice that lay ahead, she could continue to follow protocol, attending meetings, and supporting official strategies that seemed to prioritize institutional concerns over family welfare. Or she could do something that went against decades of royal tradition. She could speak out publicly and unmistakably in support of William and Catherine. The decision, when it came to her, felt inevitable. Family came first. It always had for Anne, and it always would. The question now was how to translate that conviction into action that would make a real difference. The storm clouds she had sensed that morning were indeed gathering. But perhaps, with the right approach, they could still change the direction of the wind. The following morning brought news that would force Princess Anne's hand in ways she hadn't anticipated. As she sat in her private study at Gatcombe Park, reviewing the schedule for her upcoming engagements in Scotland, her private secretary knocked with an urgent expression that Anne recognized immediately. "Your Royal Highness," he said, holding a tablet, displaying the morning's headlines. "You need to see this." The screen showed a photograph that made Anne's blood run cold. It was Catherine, captured by a long-lens camera while she was in a car with William, looking gaunt and clearly distressed. The image had been taken somewhere near Windsor, probably during what the couple thought was a private moment. The headline screamed, "Kate's Secret Crisis, Exclusive Photos Reveal Shocking Truth," and set down her coffee cup with deliberate calm. Though inside, she felt a familiar rage building. This was exactly what she had feared would happen. The relentless pursuit of a story, any story, had now crossed into territory that she found completely unacceptable. These weren't public figures performing royal duties. This was a husband and wife having what was clearly a difficult private conversation, captured and sold to the highest bidder. Her phone rang almost immediately. It was King Charles, and his voice carried an edge she rarely heard. "Have you seen the morning papers?" "I'm looking at them now," and replied. "This has gone too far, Charles. Far too far." The king agreed, and could hear the frustration in his voice. "The legal team is looking into options, but you know how these things work. By the time we could do anything official, the damage is done." The photo is already spreading across social media. And understood the institutional response. Lawyers, official complaints, careful statements crafted by committee. But she also knew that by the time such mechanisms worked, if they worked at all, William and Catherine would have endured weeks more of this torture. Sometimes, she reflected, the institution moved too slowly to protect the people who served it. After ending the call with Charles, and sat quietly in her study, looking out at the Cotswold countryside that had been her refuge for decades. This was where she came when the pressures of royal life became overwhelming, where she could think clearly without the constant background noise of palace politics and media attention. Her thoughts turned to her late mother, Queen Elizabeth II, and the advice she had given and during some of her own difficult periods. Sometimes the Queen had said, "Doing the right thing means doing the unexpected thing." Protocol serves us well most of the time, but there are moments when leadership requires stepping beyond what's comfortable, and had always interpreted this as permission to speak plainly, to cut through diplomatic language when directness was needed. But now she wondered if it meant something more, permission to act decisively when the normal channels were failing to protect family. The morning schedule included a visit to a local agricultural college, followed by a charity luncheon and an evening reception for overseas visitors. All important engagements, all representing the kind of steady, reliable royal work that and had built her reputation on. But as she reviewed the day ahead and found herself questioning whether maintaining her normal schedule was the right choice, her phone buzzed with a message from William. "Aunt, and thank you for yesterday. It meant more than you know. We're trying to stay strong, but this morning's photos, it's becoming impossible to protect the children from this." The mention of George, Charlotte, and Louis made Anne's decision for her. These were not abstract concepts of future monarchs or public figures. These were children who deserved to grow up without seeing their parents constantly under siege, and had watched William and Harry struggle with similar pressures after their mother's death, had seen the long-term impact of childhood lived under intense public scrutiny. She buzzed for her private secretary and made a request that surprised him. "Cancel everything after the agricultural college visit. I need to make some calls, and then I want to schedule something for this afternoon." "Of course, Your Royal Highness. What sort of engagement would you like me to arrange?" And paused, knowing that what she was about to say would set in motion events that couldn't be undone. "I want to visit William and Catherine again, and this time I want the press to know about it." Her secretary looked puzzled. Royal visits to family members were typically private affairs, especially during sensitive periods. Making such a visit public was unusual, and making it public during a crisis was unprecedented. "Should I coordinate with the palace press office?" he asked. "No," and said firmly. "This is a personal decision, not an institutional one. Just make sure the basic information gets to the right people, that I'll be visiting the Prince and Princess of Wales this afternoon to show my support during a difficult time." The agricultural college visit went well, as Anne's engagements typically did. She had a gift for connecting with people from all walks of life, treating farmers and professors with the same genuine interest she showed to heads of state. But throughout the morning, part of her mind was focused on the afternoon ahead and the statement she was about to make. By choosing to make her visit public, Anne was doing something that went against royal tradition in several important ways. First, she was acknowledging that there was indeed a crisis, something the palace had been reluctant to do explicitly. Second, she was taking a public position supporting William and Catherine without coordinating through official channels. Most importantly, she was using her own reputation and standing to shield them from criticism. The drive to Windsor gave Anne time to refine her approach. She had always been known for her directness, but this situation required a more nuanced touch. She needed to show unmistakable support for William and Catherine while avoiding anything that might make the situation more difficult for them. When she arrived at Adelaide Cottage, she was struck by how different the atmosphere felt from the day before. Where there had been despair and exhaustion, she now sensed something closer to determination. William and Catherine had clearly been discussing their options, and could see that they had found some measure of resolve. "We've been talking about your visit yesterday," Catherine said as they settled in the living room again, "about how good it felt to have someone just listen without trying to fix everything or strategize about response plans." William nodded. "We realized that we've been so focused on managing this crisis that we'd lost sight of what actually matters: our family, our work, the people we're supposed to serve." And was pleased to hear this shift in perspective, but she also wanted them to understand what her public visit that afternoon would mean. "I need you to know," she said carefully, "that my being here today will be noticed. I made sure of that. It's my way of showing the world that this family stands together." The conversation that followed was unlike any and had ever had with other family members. They talked openly about the pressures of royal life, the changes in media coverage over the decades, and the challenge of protecting their children while maintaining public service. Catherine spoke about her frustration with feeling unable to explain her health situation without inviting even more scrutiny. William discussed his struggle to balance his role as heir with his role as husband and father. What struck him most was their fundamental decency and commitment to duty, even in the face of treatment that would have broken many people. They weren't asking to be released from their obligations or to retreat from public life. They were simply asking for basic human dignity and the space to deal with personal challenges without constant public dissection. As news of Anne's visit began to circulate, the response was immediate and telling. Within hours, social media was filled with messages of support for both and the Wales family. The Princess Royal had always commanded deep respect from the British public, and her decision to make this visit public was being interpreted exactly as she had intended, as a clear signal that the family stood united. The palace initially seemed unsure how to respond to Anne's unilateral action. Her private secretary received several calls from various royal offices, all asking for clarification about the visit's purpose and whether it represented an official family position, and instructed him to be polite but clear. This was her personal decision as an aunt and a family member. That evening, as Anne returned to Gatcombe Park, she felt a satisfaction she hadn't experienced in years. For too long, the royal family's response to crisis had been reactive, waiting to see how bad things got before deciding how to respond. Today, she had chosen to be proactive, to show support before it became a last resort. Her phone rang shortly after dinner. It was Charles again, and this time his tone was different, still concerned, but with an undertone of what might have been approval. "Your visit this afternoon is being well received," he said. "The press coverage is much more positive than we've seen in weeks." And wasn't particularly interested in press coverage for its own sake, but she understood that positive public response would provide some relief for William and Catherine. It wasn't about press coverage, Charles. It was about doing what family members do when someone is being treated unfairly. "I know," the king replied, "and I think Mother would have approved." The comment about Queen Elizabeth II stayed with, and as she prepared for bed. Her mother had indeed understood the importance of family solidarity, but she had also been constrained by the formal requirements of her position in ways that Anne, as Princess Royal, was not. Anne's role in the family had always allowed her more freedom to speak plainly and act decisively. As she reviewed the day's events and realized that her afternoon visit was likely to be just the beginning, the problems facing William and Catherine wouldn't disappear overnight, and the media attention that had created this crisis wasn't going to simply fade away. If she was going to help them through this period, she would need to be prepared for a sustained effort. Her last thought before sleep was about the children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, and how they would remember this period in their family's life. And was determined that when they looked back, they would see not just the difficulties their parents had faced, but also the love and support that had surrounded them during one of their most challenging times. The next morning brought confirmation that Anne's instincts had been correct. The tone of news coverage had indeed shifted, with several major outlets running stories about the family's unity and the Princess Royal's reputation for steady leadership. More importantly, several prominent commentators were beginning to question whether the intense scrutiny of Catherine's health situation had gone too far, and knew this was just the beginning, but for the first time in weeks, she felt that the tide might be turning. Sometimes, she reflected over her morning coffee, the most important battles were won not through grand gestures or official statements, but through simple acts of family loyalty made visible to the world. 3 days after her public visit to Adelaide Cottage, Princess and received an invitation that would test her resolve in ways she hadn't anticipated. The request came from the BBC's flagship current affairs program, asking her to participate in an interview about the royal family's role in modern Britain. The timing was clearly no coincidence. The interview would provide a platform to address the current crisis surrounding William and Catherine directly, and had always been cautious about media interviews, preferring to let her work speak for itself rather than engaging in the kind of personal publicity that seemed to dominate modern royal coverage. But as she sat in her study at Gatcombe Park, reading the carefully worded invitation, she realized this might be exactly the opportunity she needed. The interview request came with assurances about editorial independence and the chance to address topics of her choosing. More importantly, it would reach an audience far beyond the royal bubble. Ordinary people who might have opinions about the current situation, but who rarely heard directly from senior royals about family matters. Before making any decision, and placed a call to William. Their conversation was brief, but significant. "They want to interview me about the family," she said without preamble, "about our role in modern Britain, but we both know what they're really asking about." William's response surprised her. "What do you think you would say?" "The truth," Anne replied. "That this family works harder than most people realize, that the current situation has been unfair to you and Catherine, and that the people criticizing you don't understand what royal service actually requires." There was a long pause before William responded. "If you think it would help, we trust your judgment completely," and made her decision that afternoon, calling the BBC back to accept the interview. But she set clear conditions. The conversation would be live, not pre-recorded, and she would have final approval over the topics discussed. Most importantly, the interview would take place at Gatcombe Park, on her own territory rather than in a television studio. The days leading up to the interview were filled with preparation of an unusual kind. Rather than the extensive briefing sessions that typically preceded royal media appearances, and chose to spend her time reviewing her own experiences and reflecting on the lessons she had learned over 5 decades of royal service. She thought about her early years in the public eye, when she had been criticized for being too direct or insufficiently deferential to media expectations. She remembered the period after her divorce, when every aspect of her personal life had been dissected in the press. Most relevantly, she reflected on watching William and Harry grow up in the shadow of their mother's death and their father's remarriage, seeing firsthand how family crises played out under public scrutiny. The interview was scheduled for a weekday afternoon, and spent the morning in her usual routine, checking on her horses, reviewing correspondence, and handling the administrative details that kept her royal schedule running smoothly. She had learned long ago that maintaining normalcy was the best preparation for unusual events. When the BBC crew arrived at Gatcombe Park and greeted them in the main hall with the same courtesy she would show any visitors, she had chosen to wear a simple navy dress with minimal jewelry, an outfit that projected authority without ostentation. The interview would take place in her private sitting room, a space that reflected her personality rather than royal formality. The interviewer, a respected journalist known for thoughtful questioning rather than sensationalism, began with general topics about Anne's role as Princess Royal and her decades of public service, and answered these questions easily, drawing on years of experience and genuine passion for her work. But when the conversation turned toward more sensitive territory, Anne's approach became more deliberate. The interviewer asked about the challenges facing the modern royal family, particularly in relation to media coverage and public expectations. "The fundamental challenge," Anne said, choosing her words carefully, is that people seem to forget that royal family members are human beings first. Yes, we have public duties and responsibilities that we take very seriously, but we also have the same needs for privacy, family time, and personal space that everyone else does. The interviewer pressed further, asking specifically about the current situation surrounding Catherine's absence from public engagements. Anne's response would be remembered and quoted for years afterward. "What I've seen recently troubles me deeply," she said, her voice carrying decades of authority. "The speculation and criticism directed at my nephew and his wife has crossed lines that should never be crossed. Catherine is dealing with health challenges, something that happens to millions of people every year. The difference is that most people don't have to recover while being photographed through telephoto lenses and having their every move analyzed by people who have never met them." The interviewer tried to follow up with questions about transparency and the public's right to information about royal health issues. Anne's response was swift and decisive. "The public has a right to know when royal family members are unable to fulfill their official duties," she said. "They do not have a right to medical details, personal conversations, or access to private family moments. The level of intrusion I've witnessed recently would be considered harassment if it were directed at any other family in Britain." As the interview continued, Anne found herself speaking more openly about family dynamics than she ever had before. She talked about watching William and Catherine balance their roles as public figures with their responsibilities as parents. She spoke about the unique pressures facing the heir to the throne and his wife, and the way those pressures had intensified in the age of social media. "People sometimes ask me what the royal family does to earn public support," and said at one point. Last year alone, William and Catherine completed hundreds of engagements, supported dozens of charities, and represented Britain around the world. They do this while raising 3 young children and dealing with scrutiny that would destroy most people. The idea that they somehow owe the public even more of their privacy is absurd. The most powerful moment of the interview came when Anne was asked directly about her decision to visit William and Catherine publicly during the current crisis. "I went to see them because they're family," she said simply, "because they were hurting and because the criticism they've been receiving is unfair and cruel. If standing with them publicly makes some people uncomfortable, so be it. Family loyalty isn't conditional on public approval." The interviewer tried to frame this as a criticism of the palace's handling of the situation, but Anne refused to take the bait. "This isn't about palace strategy or public relations," she said. "This is about basic human decency. When members of your family are being treated unfairly, you stand with them. It's that simple." As the interview drew to a close, and was asked what she hoped people would take away from the conversation. "I hope people will remember that behind all the ceremony and tradition, the royal family consists of real people doing a difficult job with dedication and grace," she said. "William and Catherine have given years of their lives to public service, and they'll continue to do so. But they deserve the same respect and consideration that any other family would receive during challenging times." The interview aired that evening to an audience of millions. The response was immediate and overwhelmingly positive. Social media filled with messages supporting Anne's comments and expressing sympathy for William and Catherine. More importantly, several major newspapers ran editorials the next morning calling for more respectful coverage of royal health issues. Within hours of the broadcast, Anne's private secretary was fielding calls from around the world. Other royal families expressed support for her comments, and several prominent British figures publicly endorsed her call for more respectful media coverage. The interview also had an immediate impact within the royal family itself. King Charles called to express his gratitude for Anne's willingness to speak out. Other family members, who had been reluctant to comment publicly on the situation, began making subtle gestures of support for William and Catherine. But the most meaningful response came from William and Catherine themselves. They visited Anne at Gatcombe Park 2 days after the interview aired, bringing George, Charlotte, and Louis for an informal family lunch. "We watched it together," Catherine told, and as they sat in the garden after lunch. "I cried through most of it, but they were good tears. It felt like someone was finally telling our side of the story." William was more direct. "You've given us something we haven't had in months. Hope that this situation can actually improve." And watched her great-nephews and niece playing in the garden, their laughter echoing across the countryside. These children were the future of the monarchy, but for now, they were simply children enjoying a sunny afternoon with family. Anne's intervention hadn't solved all the problems facing William and Catherine, but it had created space for moments like this. The interview marked a turning point in Anne's role within the royal family. She had always been respected for her work ethic and dedication, but now she was also recognized as someone willing to speak truth to power when family welfare was at stake. The palace establishment had initially been nervous about her decision to grant the interview, but the positive public response made it clear that Anne had correctly read the public mood. In the days following the broadcast, Anne noticed subtle changes in how the media covered royal stories. While the intense interest in William and Catherine's lives continued, the tone became more respectful. Several outlets began including disclaimers about respecting privacy during health challenges, and the most intrusive forms of coverage began to diminish. And knew that her interview wouldn't end the pressures facing William and Catherine permanently. The fundamental challenges of royal life in the digital age remained unchanged. But she had succeeded in shifting the conversation in their favor and reminding the public that royalty didn't exempt people from basic human consideration. Most importantly, she had demonstrated that when institutional responses failed to protect family members, sometimes individual action was both necessary and effective. The interview would be remembered not just for what Anne said, but for her willingness to say it when others remained silent. As she reflected on the experience in the quiet of her study that evening, and felt satisfied that she had used her position and influence in service of something that truly mattered. The storm surrounding William and Catherine was far from over, but for the first time in months, the weather seemed to be changing in their favor. 6 weeks after Princess Anne's groundbreaking television interview, the royal family was preparing for the Easter service at Windsor Castle, an annual tradition that would mark Catherine's first major public appearance since her health challenges began. The weeks following Anne's media intervention had brought gradual but significant changes to the atmosphere surrounding the Wales family. But this service would be the true test of whether public sentiment had genuinely shifted. And arrived at Windsor Castle early that morning, well before the other family members. She had always preferred to be early for family gatherings, finding that it gave her time to observe and assess situations without the pressure of performing her own public role. As she walked through the familiar corridors of the castle, she reflected on how much had changed since that morning months ago when she had first sensed the gathering storm. The response to her television interview had exceeded her expectations in almost every way. The immediate public reaction had been overwhelmingly positive, with polling showing that public support for William and Catherine had increased significantly in the weeks following the broadcast. More importantly, the nature of media coverage had evolved in ways that suggested her message had been heard by the people who needed to hear it most. Several major publications had quietly changed their editorial policies regarding royal health coverage, implementing new guidelines that prioritized dignity over sensationalism. While the intense public interest in the royal family hadn't diminished, the approach to coverage had become more measured and respectful, and had received private messages from editors acknowledging that her interview had prompted important conversations within newsrooms about the ethics of royal reporting. The changes have been most visible in the coverage of Catherine's gradual return to public life. Instead of breathless speculation about every detail of her health and recovery, news outlets have begun focusing on her actual work and engagements. When she had made brief appearances at local events near Windsor, the coverage had been warm and supportive rather than intrusive and demanding. And knew that the real test would come with events like today's Easter service, where Catherine would be visible to both the media and the general public for an extended period. The princess had been nervous about the appearance, confiding to, and during a phone call earlier in the week, that she still felt fragile and uncertain about facing the intense scrutiny that came with major royal events. "I keep wondering if people will be watching for signs of weakness," Catherine had said. "If every expression will be analyzed and interpreted." Anne's response had been characteristically direct. "Let them watch," she had said. "You have nothing to be ashamed of. You've been dealing with health challenges while maintaining your dignity and your commitment to your family and your duties. Anyone who criticizes that isn't worth your concern." As Anne settled into the chapel before the service began, she watched other family members arrive. King Charles appeared more relaxed than she had seen him in months, greeting various attendees with genuine warmth rather than the careful politeness that had marked his public appearances during the height of the crisis. The cumulative effect of positive changes in media coverage and public sentiment had clearly relieved some of the pressure he felt as both sovereign and father. When William and Catherine arrived with their children, and felt a surge of pride at how composed and confident they appeared. Catherine, in particular, looked genuinely happy for the first time in months. She was dressed elegantly, but not ostentatiously, and her interactions with other family members seemed natural and unforced. The most telling moment came when Catherine noticed and, watching her, and offered a small smile accompanied by what looked like a grateful nod. It was a subtle acknowledgement of everything that had transpired since Anne's decision to make that public visit to Adelaide Cottage. But it carried weight that only the two women fully understood. The Easter service proceeded beautifully, with the chapel filled with family members, castle staff, and invited guests from the local community, and observed how naturally Catherine interacted with everyone present, from elderly staff members she had known for years to children from local schools who had been invited to participate in the service. During the service itself, Anne found her thoughts drifting to the broader lessons of the previous months. The crisis that had seemed so overwhelming in its early stages had ultimately been resolved not through grand institutional responses or elaborate public relations campaigns, but through the simple act of family members supporting each other publicly and unambiguously. The power of her television interview had come not from any particularly eloquent phrasing or clever media strategy, but from its fundamental authenticity. She had spoken as an aunt concerned about family members she loved, and that sincerity had resonated with people who were themselves family members dealing with their own challenges and pressures. After the service, there was a traditional reception in the castle staterooms, and watched with satisfaction as William and Catherine moved through the gathering with easy confidence, engaging warmly with guests from various walks of life. The contrast with their demeanor during the worst days of the crisis was striking and heartening. Several guests approached, and during the reception, to thank her for her interview and express their support for the royal family. A local school headmaster told her that her comments had sparked important discussions among his students about the ethics of celebrity culture and media intrusion. A retired nurse mentioned that seeing Catherine's health challenges handled with dignity had helped her own family deal with a similar situation. These conversations reinforced Anne's belief that her decision to speak publicly had been correct, not just for the family, but for the broader public conversation about privacy, respect, and human dignity in the digital age. Later in the afternoon, after most of the guests had departed, the extended royal family gathered for a private lunch in one of the castle's smaller dining rooms. It was the kind of informal family gathering that had become rare during the height of the crisis, when every interaction seemed fraught with tension and uncertainty. As the conversation flowed around the table, and was struck by how normal everything felt. George, Charlotte, and Louis chattered about school projects and upcoming holidays. William and Catherine discussed plans for their upcoming engagements with genuine enthusiasm. King Charles shared amusing stories from recent state visits. The transformation was remarkable, but not complete, and understood that the fundamental challenges of royal life in the modern era hadn't disappeared. The digital age would continue to present new obstacles to privacy and dignity. Social media would continue to amplify both support and criticism. The balance between public service and private life would require constant navigation. But what had changed was the family's confidence in their ability to face these challenges together. The crisis had tested their unity and ultimately strengthened it. Anne's decision to speak publicly had demonstrated that individual family members could take action to protect each other when institutional responses proved insufficient. As the afternoon drew to a close, Catherine approached, and privately as other family members were saying their goodbyes. "I wanted to thank you properly," she said quietly. "Not just for the interview, but for everything. For listening, for understanding, and for being willing to take risks to help us." And, never comfortable with emotional displays, simply nodded. "That's what family does," she said. "What aunts do." Catherine smiled. "I hope our children will remember that when they're older. That when things got difficult, the family stood together." The comment about the children resonated with, and as she drove back to Gatcombe Park that evening, George, Charlotte, and Louis had indeed witnessed their parents face a significant challenge, but they had also seen how family loyalty and mutual support could overcome even serious difficulties. These were lessons that would serve them well in their own futures, whether as working royals or in whatever paths they might choose. In the months that followed the Easter service, the positive changes that had begun after Anne's interview continued to develop. Catherine's return to full royal duties was handled with unprecedented care and respect by the media. Public support for the Wales family remained strong, and their approval ratings reached levels not seen since their wedding. Anne herself found that her role within the family had evolved in subtle but significant ways. She remained the hardest-working royal in terms of engagement numbers, but she was also increasingly seen as the family's conscience, the member willing to speak difficult truths when necessary. The crisis had also prompted broader changes in how the royal household approached media relations and crisis management. The success of Anne's direct, authentic approach led to new strategies that prioritized transparency and human connection over traditional formal protocols. Perhaps most importantly, the experience had strengthened the bonds between family members in ways that would prove valuable for years to come. William and Catherine had learned that they could count on family support during their most difficult moments, and had discovered that her willingness to act decisively could make a real difference in protecting people she cared about. A year later, as Anne reviewed the events of that challenging period, she felt satisfied that she had used her position and influence in service of something truly important. The storm that had threatened to overwhelm William and Catherine had not only been weathered, but had ultimately made the family stronger. The royal family had always been an institution built on tradition and protocol, but Anne's actions during the crisis had demonstrated that its greatest strength lay in the simple human bonds between its members. When those bonds were tested, they had not only held firm, but had proven capable of generating the kind of authentic public connection that no amount of public relations strategy could manufacture. As she sat in her study at Gatcombe Park on a quiet evening, and reflected that sometimes the most important moments in institutional life came not from following established procedures, but from having the courage to act on fundamental values when those procedures proved inadequate. The crisis was over, but its lessons would endure. Family loyalty, publicly demonstrated and consistently maintained, remained one of the most powerful forces in both royal and ordinary life, and had always believed this, but the events of the past year had proven it in ways that would influence her approach to royal service for the rest of her career. Most importantly, William and Catherine had emerged from their ordeal not just intact, but stronger and more confident in their roles. Their children had learned invaluable lessons about resilience, family support, and the importance of standing together in difficult times. The monarchy itself had been reminded that its greatest asset was not its ceremony or tradition, but the human authenticity of the people who served it. The storm had passed, and in its wake, the royal family stood more united than they had in years.